I was saying to Mr. Powell, it was said, for example, that you became the hero of the skinheads who...
Of the skinheads? I became the hero of 90% of the people of this country for having said what they were waiting for somebody to say, for identifying a danger of which they were conscious but couldn't believe that nobody would see it or point it out.
Well,
and I still am.
And you still are. But, I mean, there was a certain amount, you will admit, of reaction. The hero of the skinheads was a phrase used in an article
No, there was no violent reaction.
As if, we've seen them reported in America as these kids with their hair shaved down who go out and occasionally beat up Pakistani people.
And that happened before my speech as well, and has not happened more since than before.
Yeah. I'm just saying... Nor was there any act of violence associated with that speech, and the one which was alleged was investigated by the police and found to be a false report. What there was, as I say, was a tremendous explosion of emotion, indeed, that at last something which threatened this country, which people had been watching coming, was recognized, was talked about. That's what happened. And since then, at least we've been able to talk about it. At least we've discussed.
At least we've been able, gradually, to elicit some of the facts. Do you know the very facts of numbers were grossly underestimated 2 or 3 years ago? I myself underestimated them. In 1964, 1965, I myself supposed that this immigrant population, which I've explained, would stabilize at roughly 1 million. And while I thought that this was something which would have been better if it had been avoided, still it didn't seem to me that it represented a major problem for the future of this country. It is the numerical facts that have changed the outlook. Yes.
I think that you as a philosopher will recognize that one of the dangers of a reasonable argument is that it's often rationalistic to the exclusion of empirical arguments, and that rationalism is not necessarily a recommendation. It may, in fact, seriously undermine the empirical and reasonable social validity of such an argument. There are so many. Well, there are so many.
Splendid.
There are so many. There are so many empirical falsehoods in what you've said that I think I'd like to take one or two of them rather carefully. First of all,
only it's my program and not yours.
No, it belongs to no one. It belongs to no one at all.
Shall I take one point?
No, first of all, the program belongs to no one. It's Mr. Cavett's program, and we are simply talking to one another.
So you and I must be careful not to hog it, and in particular...
No one is hogging. You have
particular. As I didn't interrupt your contribution, I'm sure you will only interrupt my contribution very briefly.
I'm not interrupting your contribution. I'm simply offering a point. What I want to ask you, one or two issues. Are you worrying about the increase in numbers or the increase in the number of people who the population at large feel anxious about because of some certain recognizable feature they have? Are you worrying about the increase in the size of the population or the increase of a certain element of the population which is in some way have features which are likely to...
Of course, we are not concerned with the increase in the total population from, say, 55 to 60 million. We are concerned with the increase in an element of a population which is profoundly different, thinks itself different, is seen as different from the rest. And that is where the significance both of number and of concentration comes in. Now, it could be as serious, indeed it could be more serious, if that different population were white and not colored. I can well imagine that if they were, for example, Germans or Russians who were going to be occupying 2/5 or a half of Birmingham at the beginning of the next century, we should... Yes, in occupation, living in it. But as with some of your American cities, a considerable proportion. In the case of Birmingham, it will be at least 2/5 will be occupied by the immigrants and their descendants by the early years of the next century.
Above all, their descendants.
Yes, indeed. Yes, but those descendants will still be thoroughly separate for the most part from the rest of the population because of the numbers. If the numbers were small, then of course, like any very small minority, they would filter into the population. But nobody seriously imagines that if 2/5 of Birmingham consists of a first generation of descendants born here, of people from the West Indies, from Africa, and from Asia, there will not be a profound difference between that part of the population and the rest.
I think there may be a difference. In fact, there certainly will be a difference. Whether that difference is enough to promote anxiety, unless someone declares...
You think nobody would notice?
No, I think they'll notice, certainly. The question about is whether they will notice with fear and horror unless someone announces to them that fear and horror are an appropriate response to such a fact.
I see. And you think that human nature is such that unless somebody referred to this, nobody would notice that their own native cities were transformed, that the white population was moving out and a different population was moving in?
I didn't say that.
Well, you think then that it would be noticed, but that it would not merely be tolerated, but would be taken as a desirable or acceptable development?
No, I didn't say that either.
Well, that is what you have to say. That is what you have to say, if this is not to be a problem.
No. You're simply putting words which you would find convenient in my mouth. What I said was that I didn't say that there would be no difficulties. Difficulties are in the nature of human coexistence. What I said was that the differences that there would be are not necessarily the differences which would excite fear and horror unless someone stands up and says that fear and horror are an appropriate response. Someone invested with the authority of public office. Right. When you do that, the charisma of your office and the charisma of your role as a politician will often convince people that fear and horror are an appropriate response if that is what is being told to them. It's what philosophers call a performative utterance. No doubt you're familiar with it.
And
let me go on.
No, you're not to go on, because I'm going to tell you that if you believe that, you will believe anything. It is stark nonsense to say that if I had never been born, the same dangers and problems would have existed in this country.
No, I didn't say that either.
Well, you did indeed.
No, I did not. I did not say
I've made it easier for you.
No, you haven't at all. I did not say that the same dangers would not exist. I did not say that ethnic frictions don't exist between groups that are drawn from different areas and that have different racial origins. Mm-hmm. Social cooperation is a hard and a difficult thing. I feel that you would have done your duty as a politician, as an ethical politician, much more productively if instead of exciting the notion of future strife, you had encouraged the notion of future cooperation on the basis of understanding.
Then will you tell me why it is that those in the race relations industry who profess to be trying to do just that find it necessary to draw attention to the dangers of future strife, and indeed do so in terms as strong as any that I have ever used?
I will not be saddled with the follies of the other side as well. The mere fact that errors are made by people who have the best intentions does not mean that I have to adopt their methods or favor them.
No, it doesn't,
I deplore your techniques and I deplore some of their techniques. What I ask for is not rationalism or reasonableness, but a sense of the variety of human existence, and also an attention to the capacities of human beings to absorb each other's differences, rather than an encouragement and an exhortation to excite the sense of difference and to deplore it.
And what I ask for is that you should not live in a fool's paradise.
May I ask for what's left of my part of the program? We will return after this message from our local station. I'm talking with Enoch Powell and with Jonathan Miller. Would you then have to admit that if all of the immigrants that are in question here were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, you would be less exercised over this subject than you are?
But they're not immigrants. Those wouldn't be immigrants, would they?
If there were an influx of an equal number of white Anglo-Saxon...
Well, if the population's the same, the population's the same. A problem doesn't arise, does it?
No, I think I'm stating the question clearly, aren't I? I'm saying that isn't it not logical, conceivable, probable that part of your concern is the difference in culture of these people and the difference in race.
Well,
That
of course, if there were no difference, there would be no problem, of course.
If there were, well...
Shall we start our program again?
No.
I'll start another program.
I've got one question I want to ask. If, in fact, and I recognize what it is that worries you about the arrival...
That worries me.
Or that worries the people who you supposedly represent.
That worries the people of this country.
All right, that worries the people of this country.
That's better.
Let's leave it at this moment. If you are worried, and they are worried, about the arrival of a group of people in the culture who, by reason of differences of behavior, are going to represent a stress upon that culture, I'm very surprised that one of the other forms of immigration, one of the largest influxes that has ever occurred in the history of this island, which has occurred in the last 25, 30 years, as a result of the introduction of antibiotics. It's the influx from the land of the dead, who are not usually recognized as such, an extraordinary proportion of people who are now allowed to live beyond ages which, as a result of diseases of the chest and cardiovascular system, they would not. You have recalled from another country, if you like, a very large group of people who, by virtue of their age, are throwing acute stresses upon the culture of the country, precisely because families find it very hard to live on very large numbers of occasions with old people for precisely the reasons that you are talking about, because they have different habits due to their age. Now, no one suggests, for example, that this population from the other side of the Styx are going to be given their fare and Charon's pennies to return them because they are an inconvenience due to their cultural differences from the young group upon whom they now become a burden. What we are learning to do is to accommodate old people, or should be doing, although, in fact, in the next 30 years, they will represent perhaps an even greater danger to the structure of our society if we cannot intelligently accommodate these people that we have rescued from this other foreign country, from much further away than Jamaica or from India. And I just wonder how you feel about that sort of problem, because I feel that from the metaphor of that problem, we can learn how to handle other people who've also come from other countries.
Well, you called it a metaphor, and of course it is a metaphor, and a very striking and moving metaphor. Of course, they didn't come back. They were prevented from going there. And these people are our parents, our relatives, our own flesh and blood, part of the inhabitants of this island whose age structure and whose numbers, for the reasons which you've explained, have changed. Of course there are problems there. And there are problems which, unless we were to forswear the use of antibiotics and so on...
Something which is suggested by large numbers of doctors after the age of 60, incidentally.
I said unless we were to forswear that, is inevitable. But the immigration was not inevitable. This was due to a state of the law of this country to which there is no parallel in any other country. This was due to the government of this country, and I take my share of the blame for it, deferring for too long to bring the law of this country into accord with reality. It is therefore something preventable in its growth and at any rate in part reversible, since unlike the land of the dead, a great majority of the immigrants here and their children born here are the citizens of their home countries. So there is at any rate that, along with other basic differences, the difference between something which is remediable or partly remediable and something which, failing euthanasia and so on, is not. But I think I think, if I may say so, that the contrast which the metaphor imports is a very instructive one.